Hello and welcome back to Live from Our Living Room. I'm joined today by Dennis Shea, who currently serves as director of BPC's Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy, but was, in a past life, the U.S. ambassador to the World Trade Organization. So that's what we're going to be covering today. Dennis, thanks for joining me.
Great to be with you, Ethan.
So let's set the stage here. It's 1945. The world has emerged from one of the most traumatic periods in modern history, World War II, and is determined to promote integration as a means of eliminating the interstate conflict that had defined the prior, I don't know, you tell me, 10,000 years of human history. So a number of multilateral organizations were established, the United Nations in 1945, the European Coal and Steel Community, which would eventually become the European Union, was established in 1951, and the precursor treaty to the World Trade Organization was ratified in 1948. So why was global trade, why was a global free trade institution, rather, necessary at that time? What was the rationale?
Well, the rationale was to bring countries together to restore global growth. I mean, the predecessor to the World Trade Organization was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, as you pointed out, or GATT, commonly called GATT. And it was felt in 1994, 1995, that a successor organization, as part of the Uruguay round of trade negotiations, was necessary. And so was birthed the World Trade Organization 27 years ago. And there were a variety of agreements that went into effect at that time, which the WTO was charged with administering and monitoring. And these became the global set of trade rules. The WTO was also established, though, with a forward-looking mission to become a forum for negotiating new agreements that would liberalize trade, lower tariffs, level the playing field in trade. It also was established to provide a forum for trade disputes.
And had an institution like that existed before? Obviously, countries have been trading on a bilateral basis for, as long as human history. But was there ever a multilateral institution to promote free trade?
Well, I think there have been plurilateral agreements, but there have been, of course, bilateral agreements. But GATT was a plurilateral agreement, and it was the WTO has much more members than the GATT. Today, the WTO has 164 member countries, and one of the rules of the WTO is that things are generally supposed to be decided by consensus, which means that you have to get the acquiescence, at least, of every WTO member before you make any significant decisions. So, and that becomes a very difficult situation. But we can get more into it. Different types of economies have entered. The GATT was about market economies. WTO, in my judgment, is supposed to be about market orientation and trade based on market principles. But one large member, China, which is now the second largest economy in the world, has a non-market economy, and that makes enforcing the rules even more difficult.
We're going to come back to that. But in the meantime, let's talk about, so you mentioned the WTO, its prerogative is essentially to promote free trade and provide a forum to establish bilateral trade agreements between countries. In what ways has it been successful in achieving those goals?
I would just quibble. I mean, I would say it's supposed to support liberalization of trade. I mean, there's always rules and impediments, and free trade is an ideal, but in the real world, it's hard. There are, of course, instances of free trade, but it's the WTO is more of manages the system, but the system is premised on liberalization of the rules and greater access to markets and helping developing countries integrate into the global trading system and lift themselves up economically. But unfortunately, there's been no market access agreement since the WTO, multilateral market access agreements that the WTO was established. In other words, no round that actually reduced tariffs. The only one multilateral agreement was the Trade Facilitation Agreement 2015, which is designed to cut red tape at borders and customs. And that's a useful agreement, an important agreement, but it's not a multilateral trade liberalization effort. So I think there's a general consensus that the WTO has not done well, has underperformed, let's say, with respect to serving as a forum for negotiations of new trade agreements.
So let's talk about the challenges then. And you already mentioned China. One concern we've heard repeatedly, and that has animated American politics for several election cycles, is that China is abusing its membership in the WTO and in its bilateral trade agreements. You've been critical of China here and elsewhere. So what specifically do you find concerning?
I'll talk about the WTO, the WTO context. The belief in the United States and in, I think, the Western market economies that were part of the WTO that brought in China was that China would move more towards a market-oriented system. And that has not been the case. It's difficult to get market access in a number of key industries in China. It is not transparent. The system there is not based on the rule of law. And in my judgment, and many others, that the WTO is founded on these norms of transparency, reciprocity, rule of law, market orientation, and those values, those norms do not define the current Chinese, economic system. The United States, has tried to enforce the rules at the WTO against Chinese practices that we have found objectionable. We have brought 27 cases against China at the WTO and have won every one in which there's been a final judgment, but the needle has not moved. In fact, the underlying policies, remain in place. So that is why the Trump administration resorted to tariffs. We've had years of bilateral engagement through various forms with China. That's why we've brought 27 cases at the WTO, and it just wasn't effective in disciplining Chinese practices that we found objectionable. So that's why the tariffs were posed as a way to try to, we'll try something different here, and that's what we did. And they're at least for now being maintained by the Biden administration, and the Biden administration is insisting on enforcement of currently of phase one of the trade deal with China.
This seems like a pretty profound current working against the WTO. I mean, so the other pressing challenge that I want to talk to you about is just an evolving attitude about trade generally. I mean, in the US, opinion polling showed overwhelming support for free trade and liberal trade, as you say. Prior to the pandemic, that support has fallen significantly, especially among Republicans. What's driving that change, especially within the pandemic context?
Well, I think in the past, the trade philosophy was basically consumer welfare oriented. If anything lowered costs, that was a good thing for the consumer. But then we realized that, there's something called the China shock, where, millions of people in certain segments of the United States lost jobs. And we have lost some of our productive capacity at the United States. And then COVID hit, and we realized that we didn't have access to PPE. We realized that a lot of the pharmaceutical industry is, pharmaceuticals are manufactured overseas. We realize that we're vulnerable with respect to semiconductors, which run the country. We really need access to semiconductors, but we don't have, massive, major production capacity here in the United States. So all these things, I think, have led to a reevaluation of the underlying premise of trade as being, consumer orientation, maximization of consumer welfare. Consumer welfare, of course, is important, but we also need to have a productive capacity. And that, I think, is embraced by a lot of Democrats on the Hill. I mean, the Biden administration, their trade policy is defined by the need to be worker-centric. So I think there is a broad alignment, a shift, and there's from to a more worker-oriented, production-oriented view of trade. And of course, I think there are people in both political parties. It's not that have a different view of the purpose of trade. I think the U.S., the Trump administration, we believed in market access. So we felt that expanding access to markets overseas was very important for us. So we renegotiated the Japanese, we had two new Japanese trade deals. We renegotiated the Korean trade deal. We did USMCA, of course, renegotiated NAFTA, had a new trade deal with Mexico and Canada. Got far along with negotiating a trade deal with the United Kingdom. So we believe in, at least we believed in expanding opportunities, trying to knock down market access barriers for our exporters. But I think there's an alignment, a broad-based alignment within both parties on some of these principles.
Yeah, exactly. To your point, that there are prominent critics of the WTO on the left side of the aisle among elected officials, environmental and labor activists. We hear rhetoric on the campaign trail that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago about trade. And, you mentioned the UK as well. We can understand Brexit, at least partially, in the context of trade and a pivot towards protectionist industrial policy. So with this fundamental shift taking place, not only in the US, but around the globe, what's the future of the WTO?
Well, I think it's murky, I think, at this point. I think the future lies more with the idea of plurilateral agreements. There are a number going on at the WTO, focused on issues like digital trade and e-commerce that not all WTO members are party to. When I was at the WTO and this plurilateral was ongoing, we insisted that it be high standard and reciprocal, and which perhaps is in conflict with the most favored nation principle at the WTO, where everyone benefits, even if they're not a party to the negotiation. So we shall see. I think the jury's still out on the WTO, but the recent years have not shown that the WTO to be as relevant as it probably could be.
Well, Dennis, you have an event today. You're speaking with the former Director General of the WTO, Roberto Azevedo. I'm sure going to be getting into even more detail than we did today. So good luck. By the time this is posted, it will be posted on the BPC website. So check it out. And thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Ethan. Good to be with you.